Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Today, I've got a very special discussion on the relationship between folk history and fantasy. I'm very lucky to be joined by Yizz the Eunuch. How are you today?
Oh, I'm just lovely. Thank you very much. It is a pleasant, misty December morning here. I've already had my walk and been to the gym, so I am ready to roll.
Oh, splendid. And thank you again for coming on because I think this is going to be a very nice, cozy discussion. So I just want to ask you a question before we get into the material proper. But
Sure.
what does folk history mean to you? Yes.
To me, folk history means not just knowing the people you came from, but why the people you came from matter. The songs they sing, the religions they've had, the wars they've fought, the hardships they've endured. That's a big part of it. It's not just tracing your family lineage and seeing if you're related to some baron or some king or something like that. But folk history to me, since I grew up in Appalachia in a huge family clan, dozens of cousins and aunts and uncles and stuff. We sang songs together. My family was big into playing bluegrass. I don't know if you know that kind of music or not, but it's the more upbeat, twangy. To people outside of America, it might sound like a fast-paced country music, but it's a different animal, really. Bluegrass is a fork in folk music where country music that people know, like Hank Williams Jr. and stuff like that, that's one direction that folk music took. Another direction in America folk music took, especially in Appalachia, well, pretty much only in Appalachia, is a type of music called bluegrass. And my family was big into bluegrass. My mother plays hammered dulcimer and piano. My uncles played guitars and drums and banjos and flutes and fiddles and all kinds of stuff. And so I grew up in a family that danced together, and we played our own family's music as well as family music from all different places in Appalachia. Several of my family went to Nashville and helped record with different professional bluegrass musicians in Nashville, which, if you don't know, Nashville, Tennessee, the capital of Tennessee in America, is, if not the one of the major music cities in all of America, specifically for country music and bluegrass. And of course, old timey rock and roll and rockabilly. So music was a big part of my cultural history growing up because the songs taught me about what it was like to be a man, a young man having to go off to fight in the war for Southern independence in the 1800s, and not in like a modern way, but like in an old timey way where the men at the time didn't want to go to war. They didn't want to fight, but they had to. They felt pressured from different reasons to go to fight. And then on top of that, there's a very heavy religious element because, like we were talking about before stream, there's a very heavy religious, old-timey Southern Christian energy to all of the folk history here. And that's why, even though technically I'm more of the agnostic atheist type, like internally, being a Protestant Christian is a huge part of the cultural identity here, especially how I was raised. So there's a lot of, are we doing God's will? Do we need to do what's right? Or what we're doing, is it pleasing in the eyes of God? That's a big part of the cultural folk music and folk history I grew up with as well. And that's why I think that Hollywood and city folk are so heavily denigrating to the Appalachian people, my people, is because we have a very righteous, indignant streak to us that doesn't like the war machine, doesn't like the modern gay pause, doesn't like global empire of usury and stuff. And so they denigrate us. And I've always sort of been raised to view all of that stuff as sort of a hostile outside faction. And that was a big part of my cultural history growing up too, is stay off my land, don't trust the banks, don't trust a man that comes from the government. That was also a big part of how I was raised. So folk history is all of that stuff, plus learning why all of that stuff came about. So I was taught about the American independence era, the French Revolution, what things were like going all the way back to the Enlightenment forward, just the broad strokes when you're a kid, talking about where you came from, why it mattered, why America is separate from the United Kingdom, separate from the British Empire. And that stuff was fed to me not in a polarized, you're an American, so you got to hate the Brits, or you're American, so you got to, be anti-European or whatever. That's not how I was raised. I was raised to view it all as we're part of this thing, this civilizational thing that adds to my folk history. We're not exactly that. Like, we're not exactly German, we're not exactly English, we're not exactly Scottish, but we're some of all of those North European, especially British Isles things. And I've always carried that with me. Like I was raised on the Bible. I was raised on Ivanhoe, Arthurian legends. I was raised on Lord of the Rings, and even things like my dad was kind of a nerd too, so he raised me on Conan and Star Wars and Star Trek and stuff like that too. So it's it's interesting being from Appalachia, getting a nice healthy dose of like old literature, old British and European history mixed with our own genuine new American history. Because in the scope of things, the American and Appalachian ethnicity, my ethnicity, is a very new thing that only came about like 150, 200 years ago. So it's it's interesting being an older person now. I'm in my mid 40s and seeing how all of that stuff matters and how it's under attack and being threatened by the things that exist today. And of course, if you want to know more about my opinions on that stuff, you can check out my channel.
Well, thank you for all of that. Yes, that's very wonderful and insightful. And what I know, especially about Appalachians, is obviously if we go back, the term Scotch Irish comes up a lot. The
Mhm.
You're mostly descended of the Scottish folk that emigrated to they set up the plantation of Ulster, who then
Mhm.
later migrated to America. So hence the term Scotch Irish. So
Yeah,
a long
the Ulster
history.
Scots, and the English who settled Virginia, the Virginian colony, and the I forget the original name of the one just north of that. It might have been the Massachusetts colony. I don't remember because my original American history colonial era is not great. But the people that my family line comes from most are the Ulster Scots primarily, and then the English as well. And there's some Irish in my family, but my family line is mostly English and Scottish from the Ulster Scots.
Hmm. Yes, I just think it's interesting that you've got this people who they migrate to another land, and then generations later then migrate again to another land. So it's this long sort of multi-generational journey of settlement, sort of struggle and hardship. So it makes for a very interesting reading and a very strong and hardy people.
Hmm. We certainly are. We certainly are. That's one of the reasons why so many people in the most elite reaches of the U.S. military. Not that I'm a big fan of the War Machine, you guys know that, but so many of the people that are in like Green Beret, Special Forces, Delta Force, Navy SEALs, they are men from Appalachia. Like my uncle, much older than me. I think he's 60 something now. He was my father's youngest brother. He was a Green Beret. He did lots of airdrops. He was did a lot of things in the 70s and 80s. And he told me that it was so frequent that he would bump into people that lived within like 100 miles of where we all grew up at the highest reaches of all of the active military things. Because one guy that ended up in the same, I think it was Green Beret or Special Forces unit he was in, was a guy that went to high school with him. And they didn't even, like they didn't even enlist together or anything. They just so many men are hardy and good at survival and grew up with good genetics and good parenting. So many of us have a will to fight and explore. We end up in the highest reaches of the military in America. It's interesting to look into.
Well, I think the Appalachians have what the Arab scholar Ibn Khaldun would refer to as asabaya, a social cohesion or group feeling. And well, because Ibn Khaldun does state that asabaya tends to decline over several generations, but when I look at the Appalachians, I still think you've managed to retain that somewhat better than other people, I think. So,
Yep, I would agree. I think so. Because
mhm.
even today in this sad era of deracination and social media and anti-white mind poison and just anti-faith stuff where everybody's just social media and the machine wants to herd everyone into just these little materialist boxes. Around me today, where I live, life is kind of the same as it was 45 years ago when I was a kid. Like, I still see people out in the yard playing. I still see families hanging out, playing banjo, playing bluegrass music together. I see people out in their gardens with kids. So things are still pretty healthy here. And I can walk down the street, wave at people. People know my name. I know their name. And it still feels pretty connected and pretty, I would say, ethnically energized here, as opposed to a lot of places I visited in America, which are just kind of vacuous wastelands where there's no real culture at all happening. Just sort of, you know, We talk about the GAE a lot, the gay culture. That's what you see in a lot of places in America, sadly, but not around here, thankfully. There's still a lot of good, genuine, in my opinion, healthy, original Appalachian culture happening around me that I get to see every day when I leave the house, and it's very uplifting to see that has not been crushed here.
Well, that's very nice to hear. Yes,
Mhm.
unfortunately, where I am, I think the native culture and folk has been crushed quite a bit, sadly. But perhaps one
Definitely.
day it shall return. But I think in some areas of the country it's better preserved. So, right. Well, without further ado, I'd like to sort of jump into the main sort of presentation. So, folk history and fantasy. So, for this discussion, the main example I want to talk about and discuss with you is the Noldor elves from Tolkien's Silmarillion. So, just to give a bit of background, so in the Silmarillion, so Lord of the Rings, which is what he's best known for,
Mhm.
sort of is a tale about the destruction of the One Ring during the end of the Third Age. So, of course, in his world, there are many ages and many hundreds, if not thousands, of years of history of different cultures. And so, if we're looking at the Noldor, we're going right the way back to the beginning of the First Age, so thousands of years before the Lord of the Rings. And because remember, the elves are an incredibly
Mhm.
lived people.
Mhm.
They pretty much cannot die of sickness or old age. The only thing that can really kill them is a sword in the gut, essentially.
Mhm.
So there are characters that are in the Silmarillion or in these very early stories that still are around in Lord of the Rings. So, for example, the elf lady Galadriel, she is an Noldor elf, and she's related to some of the characters we're going to be mentioning. I'm going to bring up. So, it just shows you how long this stretches out through the course of Tolkien's work. Um, so so to start with, there are many clans of elves in the work, but the Noldor, the one I really want to talk about. So to sort of get an understanding, so you've got Middle Earth, and then you've got Valinor, which is the other continent in the west, the place that all the elves sail to. You remember at the end of Lord of the Rings, where they
Mhm.
get on the boat and they sail over. It's oh, sorry, I just want to address a comment. Blue Flame and Grief. Tolkien's elves die of grief too. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. I nearly neglected that. Yeah, so because Valinor is essentially, I think a good way of understanding it is a bit like a physical manifestation of heaven, because that's where
Mhm.
the Valar, or the divine angelic beings of the world,
Yeah.
reside.
It's sort of like
And
how some cultures have westing, like going west. That's sort of that's what the elves do to retire or to sort of step back from life. They go to their little heaven island to sort of meet their end, so to speak, but in a way that's not human, in a way that's elven.
indeed, and yes, because the Noldor actually start by they're created in Middle Earth, and they do a great voyage over to Valinor, where they reside. So the original leader of the Noldor is their king Finwë, and he has three sons, Fëanor, and then through another wife he has two other sons, Fingolfin and Finarfin. Yes, that may be a bit of a confusion in this. There are lots of names beginning with F, so I hopefully we're not all going to get too muddled or confused. Yeah,
I'll
so
do
you've
my
got the
best, but I'm not making any promises.
no, certainly. Yes, you've got the Noldor as a people. You've got their king Finwë, and so I mentioned Fëanor, the eldest son. So Fëanor is a great craftsman, and he produces three jewels called the Silmarils. And what he does is that he fills the Silmarils with the light. So in at this stage of the history, there isn't a sun. Instead, the whole world is illuminated by these two giant trees that are in Valinor, that were fashioned by the Valar Yavanna. She's sort of the Valar of nature, and so this is the source of light. And he fills the Silmarils with the light from these two trees. And again, I think this is a little bit of the Norse coming into Tolkien's mythology, because I think of Yggdrasil, the world tree,
Yeah,
when you look at these trees of Valinor.
that's
So
what I thought of too. Is Yggdrasil? Yeah, Yggdrasil. I think isn't how you say it in Nordic? Is Yggdrasil?
more or less, yeah. hmm And so, yeah, he fills it. So you've got these wonderful, well-crafted jewels by Fëanor that are filled with this beautiful light of the two trees. And Now, this is where the main antagonist of the Silmarillion comes in. I'm sorry, I should say that is where the Silmarillion gets its name from. Silmarillion, the tale of the jewels, the Silmarils,
Okay.
because they are very prominent. So this is when the main antagonist, Melkor, the very first Valar that was spawned, later branded Morgoth or Black Foe, comes in. So he caused a lot of trouble for the Valar and the main god Eru Ilúvatar originally, and he was punished. But they later felt, you've had enough punishment, we're going to forgive you now, just don't cause any more trouble. Oh boy, because he then causes a great deal of terror and destruction. So while this is going on, so I mentioned Fëanor and his two half-brothers. Well, Fëanor, as the eldest brother, has a bit of a falling out with his half-siblings, but he later does reconcile with them, and to celebrate, they have this grand, wonderful feast in Valinor. And while this is going on, Morgoth, well, Melkor still, finds this giant black evil spider called Ungoliant, and it's even believed that Ungoliant is a progenitor of Shelob, the spider from Lord of the Rings.
So was it a hostile force of nature like that represents betrayal and killing out of necessity? Is that what it represents?
I think so. I think that's a fair categorization of Ungoliant. So Melkor rides Ungoliant, and while all the elves are having this feast, they destroy the two trees, and she sucks out the lights from the trees. And then after that, so it plunges the whole world into darkness, and all the elves are in a panic. So using this as a distraction, then Melkor and Ungoliant then find the palace of the Noldor, where Finwë was residing, because he didn't actually go to the feast, Finwë. And when they get there, Morgoth kills Finwë and then steals the Silmarils, because beforehand, Morgoth actually tries to persuade Fëanor to betray the elves and hand over the Silmarils, but Fëanor doesn't do this. However, the doubts Melkor sows in Fëanor's mind certainly, let's just say, betray a sense of distrust in Fëanor against them, which we'll get into in a bit. So this is what's happened. So the two trees have been destroyed, the world's in darkness, and the Silmarils have been stolen, and the king of the Noldor is dead. And so they all find out what's going on, and then Fëanor, as being the eldest son, is now the king of the Noldor, and he now has to address the situation. And he personally blames the Valar for what's happened, because he thinks they should have been more vigilant in preventing the Silmarils being stolen.
Because they were the ones that decided to free Morgoth, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And also, it didn't help that Morgoth had actually doubted these seeds of doubt into Fëanor's mind about the nature of the Valar. And and it's actually Fëanor is the one who brands Melkor Morgoth for this act of destruction. And what's also interesting, I think, is Fëanor, as we'll get into, I think is much more concerned about the loss of the Silmarils than he is of the destruction of the two trees, which I think is a recurring theme in Lord of the Rings. You've got the idea of man, or, mortals are fallible, they are materialist, and they're not, perhaps I would say, not concerned with the more troublesome aspects that happen. The light of the world.
Even long-lived mortals like elves are, by necessity, more concerned with material because they're not divine beings.
Yes. And again, I think this is an interesting lesson, again, for the Asada of folk history. I think as a people, you have to understand what's important. Your people and your livelihood and your survival is more important than, some jewels, even though they are very nice jewels that contain this this light. And this is actually the first reading I want to do from the Silmarillion, because
I'm all ears.
Right. Okay, so this is Fëanor. So he gives a speech before all of the elves. So, okay. Right. Now when it was known that Morgoth had escaped from Valinor and pursuit was unavailing, the Valar remained long seated in darkness in the Ring of Doom, and the Maiar and the Vanyar stood beside them and wept. But the Noldor, for the most part, returned to Tirion and mourned for the darkening of their fair city. Through the dim ravine of the Calasyria, fogs drifted in from the shadowy seas and mantled its towers, and the lamp of the Mindon burned pale in the gloom. Then suddenly Fëanor appeared in the city and called on all to come to the high court of the king upon the summit of Tuna. But the doom of banishment that had been laid upon him was not yet lifted, and he rebelled against the Valar. A great multitude gathered swiftly, therefore, to hear what he would say, and the hill and all the stairs and streets that climbed upon it were lit with the light of many torches, that each one bore in hand. Fëanor was a master of words, and his tongue had great power over hearts. He would never use it. He would use it, and that night he made a speech before the Noldor which they ever remembered. Fierce and fell were his words, and filled with anger and pride. In hearing them, the Noldor was stirred to madness. His wrath and his hate were given most to Morgoth, and yet well nigh all that he came said from the very lies of Morgoth himself, that he was distraught with grief for the slaying of his father, and with anguish for the rape of the Silmarils. He claimed now the kingship of all the Noldor, since Finwë was dead, and he scorned the decrees of the Valar. Why, O people of the Noldor, he cried, why should we no longer serve the jealous Valar, who cannot keep us nor even their own realm secure from their enemy? And though he be now their foe, are not they and he of one kin? Vengeance calls me hence. But even were it otherwise, I would not dwell longer in the same land with the kin of my father's slayer and of the thief of my treasure. Yet I am not the only valiant in this valiant people. And have ye not all lost your king? What else have ye not lost, cooped here in a narrow land between the mountains and the sea? Here once was light, that the Valar begrudged to Middle-earth, but now dark levels all. Shall we mourn here, deedless forever, a shadow folk, mist haunting, dropping vain tears in the thankless sea? Or shall we return to our home in Cuvinan, sweet around the waters under unclouded stars, and wide lands lay about, where a free people might walk? There they lie still and wait us, who in our folly forsook them. Come away, let the cowards keep this city. Long he spoke, and ever he urged the Noldor to follow him, and by their own prowess to win freedom and great realms in the lands of the east, before it was too late. For he echoed the lies of Melkor, that the Valar had cozened them, and would hold them captive so that men might rule the Middle-earth. Many of the Eldar heard him for the first of the aftercomers. There shall the end be, he cried. Though long and hard shall be the road, say farewell to bondage, but say farewell also to ease. Say farewell to the weak, say farewell to your treasures. More still shall we make. Journey light, but bring with you your swords, for we will go further than Orome, endure longer than Tolkis. We will never turn back from pursuit. After Morgoth to the ends of the earth, war shall he have, and hatred undying. But when we have conquered and have regained the Silmarils, then we and we alone have conquered, and we shall be lords of the unsullied light, and masters of the bliss and beauty of Arda. No other race shall oust us. Then Fëanor swore a terrible oath. His 7 sons leapt straight away to his side, and took the self-same vow together, and red as blood shone their drawn swords in the glare of the torches. They swore an oath which none shall break, and none should take, by the name even of Ilúvatar, calling the everlasting dark upon them if they kept it not. And Manwë they named in witness, and Varda, and the hallowed mountain of Taniquetil, vowing to pursue with vengeance and hatred to the ends of the world Valar, demon, elf, or man, as yet unborn, or any creature, great or small, good or evil, that time should bring forth unto the end of days, whoso should hold or take or keep a Silmaril from their possession. Thus spoke Medros and Maglor and Caligorm, Curufin, Caranthir, Amrod, and Amras, princes of the Noldor, and many quailed to hear the dread words. For so swoon, good or evil, an oath may not be broken, and it shall pursue oath keeper and oath breaker to the world's end. Fingolfin and Turgon, his son, therefore spoke against Fëanor, and fierce words awoke, so that once again wrath came near to the edge of swords. But Finarfin spoke softly, as was his wont, and sought to calm the Noldor, persuading them to pause and ponder ere deeds were done that could not be undone. And Orodreth, alone of his sons, spoke in like manner. Finrod was with Turgon, his friend, but Galadriel, the only woman of the Noldor to stand that day tall and valiant among the contending princes, was eager to be gone. No oaths she swore, but the words of Fëanor concerning Middle-earth had kindled in her heart, for she yearned to see the wide, unguarded lands, and to rule there a realm of her own will. Of like mind was Galadriel with Fingon, Fingolfin's son, being also moved by Fëanor's words, though he loved him little, and with Fingon stood as they ever did Angrod and Egnor, sons of Finarfin. But these held their peace and spoke not against their fathers. At length, after long debate, Fëanor prevailed, and the greater part of the Noldor there assembled he set aflame with the desire of new things and strange countries. Therefore, when Finarfin spoke yet again for heed and delay, a great shout went up, Nay, let us be gone. and straight away Thaina and his sons began to prepare for the marching forth. So that's the end of that bit. So as we can see here, Fëanor manages to convince the Noldor to en masse leave Valinor and go to East and Middle Earth to reclaim the Silmarils. And again, there we can see that there was a lot of what we might call anger and haughtiness, but also bravery and determination. So
yeah,
so I think it's good to have these qualities in a people to want to have these qualities, but also as we'll get into later, I think there's also an element of reckless folly. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah. I have feelings listening to that. I close my eyes and listen to it intently to try to get the meaning from it, because I can't retain all the names and words. I just have to do my best. But the feelings that I got listening to you read that passage, it reminds me of the reason why adventurers and explorers came to America, the continent America, in the first place. And it also speaks to me about what I have read and what I was taught about the American Revolution period, where you had the perceived, whether genuine or not, the perceived tyranny, the perceived problem, ethically, materially, morally, and why there was a divergence within the same Anglosphere set of people. And it reminded me of that energy of, we have to go our own way. The crown is corrupt. Have these people not failed you? That type of energy from the story. And I feel like that's a building block of my ethnic group, the Appalachians, because we have a very indignant, not selfish, but folk-focused energy in us, where we don't care about the crown, we don't care about the king, because we feel like all of those things of rulership have failed us, and we got to go our own way in the mountains for our own people's well-being. And that's sort of how I was raised, like with that energy. And I feel a lot of that energy from this part of this story that you just read, where the man speaking and leading his sons and then inspiring Galadriel and the other one to go with them to a new land under the stars. That spoke to me at a paternal level, because that is a powerful thread of my identity and my spirit as an Appalachian. Does that scan with what you know of the story and the material? Does that connect?
No, I think it does, and thank you. No, I very much get that semblance as well. The one thing I would say, though, is remember that Fëanor is the king, and he's not railing against other men, he's railing against the gods. So there is a level of what we might call blasphemy or transgression in here as well.
Okay,
no, I still think what you said is very good, and I agree with it. I'm just saying that there's shall we say, a bit of a dark underside to it as well, because remember, he is rebelling against gods as well.
Oh, okay. I didn't understand that part, because again, I don't really grasp the Silmarillion. It's complex for me. And I haven't read it and studied it. So the things that chose to punish and then free Morgoth were not powerful elves. They were the elves' divinities that did that.
Yeah. So the Valar are the so you have Eru Ilúvatar, who is essentially the Tolkien equivalent of like the Christian gods, and then you have the Valar, who are these divine beings. The best way of describing them is they're a bit like the elves. Not the elves, sorry. They're a bit like the angels in Christian. Like the Archangel Saint Michael or something.
Gotcha.
But they're like that. But they're also like the Aesir, the Norse pantheon, or like the Greek pantheon. For example, you've got Olmo, who's the Valar of water, so he's a bit like Poseidon, for example. You've got Manwë, who's the god of the sky, and so he's a bit like Zeus, for example.
Okay, well then that puts a new light on this. Then knowing that now and being able to prioritize it in my head, I can also see a cautionary tale here about, well, look what's happened since the split of the Anglosphere, the Commonwealth versus the Americans, etc. In a way, even post-Enlightenment, we have all forsaken the divine. We have all forsaken that necessary strata of organization. And what has come of it? Conflict, jealousy, greed, war over territory, war over material goods, because we no longer share that divine bond and that divine structure anymore. So I could see why, even though there are positive elements of that story that enkindle me and make me feel like, I am part of a motivated people that left for real reasons, there's also a sad darkness to it that my people wouldn't be what we are here in Appalachia if my forebears didn't turn their back on that king, on that divine order, and on that divine structure. So that's a bit of I guess a dark part of that too for my identity, knowing that I come from people who, we're part of that separation of the older way, the divine order.
And it's interesting you say that because I cast my mind back to a couple of weeks ago where obviously you had Remembrance Sunday here, and I think you have it in America as well, but I think it's
Yeah.
called Veterans Day, the 11th of November.
It's the same holiday, just different name, yeah.
Yeah, because I remember Charlemagne put out a tweet basically saying that, the British have this unhealthy veneration for the veterans of the world wars, and, nothing in America compares. Even the reverence for Confederate veterans doesn't quite meet the same level, and, you need to stop or you're doomed. And I quote tweeted him and said, no, I completely agree with you. We do venerate it far too much. And okay, that is, you can say that's transgressive, you can say that's disrespectful, but the point is, yes, they died fighting, but they were horrible, destructive wars that were completely unnecessary.
Yeah,
And
I agree.
And I think the whole veneration for them is part of the Boomer Truth regime, and you
I do
will
too.
never be able to move beyond it if we just fixate on it.
Right. And that's because you guys know that I am very much pro-white. I'm part of the ethnic racial white identity cluster of content creators, but I am not someone who glorifies nor vilifies either the Axis or the Allied powers of that period, because I feel like the leaders of all people involved were led astray, made bad choices, and whether on purpose or via negligence, led us to that horrible war. Now, I do know that because of the augmented history of the winners write the history books, I know that the axial power leaders, most people have a very one-sided view of what their motives were and what obeisances they made towards peace before World War II. But all of that being said, I view all of the world wars, 1 and 2, as a horrific tragedy that we should not celebrate. And all of us who care about the West, white people, or your ethnicity within Western civilization, I think that we need to escape the shadow. We need to flee from the specter of that war era and not glorify it and move beyond it and do better next time, because that's a dark, terrible period of our history. And in the long future, it might even be the marking point of the decline of Western civilization, unless we can right this and heal.
No, thank you for that, Yizz. And yeah, so back to the Noldor, and unfortunately, things are going to take a bit of a darker turn now with another reading. So I have this image up here called the Kinslaying of Alqualondë, and this is the event I'm now going to read and go over. Okay, so after that speech, so Fëanor is completely committed. He and the Noldor are going to sail over, and his brother Fingolfin and Finarfin are also going to come and bring their hosts with them as well. So, okay, but they need to actually get some ships. So they go to the ports of Alqualondë, led by the elves known as the Teleri, because they're seafarers. So, okay. Now Fëanor led the Noldor northward because his first purpose was to follow Morgoth. Moreover, Túna beneath Taniquetil was set nigh to the girdle of Arda, and there the great sea was immeasurably wide, whereas ever northwards the sandering seas grew narrower, as the wasteland of Araman and the coast of Middle-earth drew together. But as the mind of Fëanor cooled and took counsel, he perceived overlate that all these great companies would never overcome the long leads to the north, nor cross the seas at the last, save with the aid of ships. Yet it would need long time and toil to build so great a fleet, even were there any among the Noldor skilled in that craft. He resolved now, therefore, to persuade the Teleri, ever friends to the Noldor, to join with them, and in his rebellion he thought that thus the bliss of Valinor might be further diminished, and his power for war upon Morgoth be increased. He hastened then to Alqualondë, and spoke to the Teleri as he had spoken before in Tirion. But the Teleri were unmoved by aught that he could say. They were grieved indeed at going of their kinsfolk and long friends, but rather dissuade them than aid them, and no ship would they lend, nor help in the building against the will of the Valar. As for themselves, they desired now no other home but for the strands of Eldamar, and no other lord than Olwë, prince of Alqualondë. and he had never lent ear to Morgoth, nor welcomed him to his land, and he trusted still that Ulmo and the other great among the Valar would redress the hurts of Morgoth, and that the night would pass yet to a new dawn. Then Fëanor grew wrathful, and he still feared delay, and hotly he spoke to Olwe. You announced your friendship, even in the hour of our need, he said, yet you were glad indeed to receive our aid when you came at last to these shores. Faint-hearted loiterers and well-nigh empty-handed, in huts on the beaches would you be dwelling still, had not the Noldor carved out your haven and toiled upon your walls. But Olwe answered, we renounce no friendship, but it may be the part of a friend to rebuke a friend's folly. And when the Noldor welcomed us and gave us aid, otherwise than you spoke, in the land of Aman, we were to dwell forever as brothers whose houses stand side by side. But as for our white ships, those you gave us not, we learned not that craft from the Noldor, but from the lords of the sea, and the white timbers we wrought with our own hands, and the white sails were woven by our wives and our daughters. Therefore, we will neither give them nor sell them for any league of friendship. For I say to you, Fëanor, son of Finwë, these are to us, as are the gems of the Noldor, the work of our hearts, whose like we shall not make again. Thereupon Fëanor left him, and sat in dark thought beyond the walls of Alqualondë, until his host was assembled. When he judged that his strength was enough, he went to the haven of swans, and began to man the ships that were anchored there, and to take them away by force. But the Teleri withstood him, and cast many of the Noldor into the sea. Then swords were drawn, and a bitter fight was fought upon the ships, and about the lamplit quays and piers of haven, and even upon the great arch of its gate. Thrice the people of Fëanor were driven back, and many were slain upon either side, but the vanguard of the Noldor were succoured by Fingon with the foremost of the host of Fingolfin, who coming up and found a battle joined and their own kin falling, and rushed in before they knew rightly the cause of the quarrel. Some thought indeed that the Teleri had sought to waylay the march of the Noldor at the bidding of the Valar. Thus at last the Teleri were overcome, and a great part of their mariners that dwelt in Alqualondë were wickedly slain. For the Noldor were become fierce and desperate, and the Teleri had less strength, and were armed for the most part but with slender bows. Then the Noldor drew away their white ships, and manned their oars at best they might, and rowed them north along the coast. And Olwe called upon Osse, but he came not, for it was not permitted by the Valar that the flight of the Noldor should be hindered by force. But Eunuch wept for the mariners of the Teleri, and sea rose in wrath against the slayers, so that many of the ships were wrecked and those in them drowned. Of the kinslaying at Alqualondë, more is told in that lament which is named the Noldorlante, the fall of the Noldor, that Maglor made ere he was lost. So, as we just heard in that, the Noldor turn on this other clan of elves, the Teleri, and slaughter them in order to seize their ships, to say at least. So, this is a horrifically dark moment here, where the Fëanor is so single-mindedly set on reclaiming the Silmarils that he's literally going to commit co-ethnic genocide, pretty much
dark.
against another group of elves. And I really thought that was quite interesting when Arome, the leader of Teleri, is saying, "You would deprive us our most prized possession, our ships, like how you were deprived of the Silmarils. So, two wrongs don't make a right, essentially."
I can see why you made the thumbnail and called it the kinslaying at Alqualondë. I can see that, yeah.
Well, no, this image is because my edition of the Silmarillion is a lovely illustrated edition, and all the illustrations in here are by a Tolkien artist called Ted Naismith, and so
I see his name there. Yeah.
So this art is actually in my book, and
Beautiful.
And I've actually got lots of his other images as well, because they're really wonderful, and I think really help illustrate the narrative. So,
and this is a good narrative tale to sort of back up why me and a lot of people that, in my opinion, are moral about the problems we face today and take a more moral high ground, trying to end brother wars and end this what AA coined the boomer truth regime. This, I feel like in the era that we live in, you have wealthy powers that are sort of like analogous to Morgoth and other negative dark forces of entropy, greed, jealousy, etc. You could call them I don't know, like deadly sins in the Christian paradigm, I guess. But it seems like darkness and sin and entities that thrive on conflict are the ones calling the shots, and they occupy every divinity socket in our culture right now. And I feel like that we're only ever going to get this image if we don't break that control and go our own way. And I view this, the kinslaying, as sort of analogous to what I talk about there being no more brother wars. Like we can't have our people, meaning all of Western kind, we can't have each other we can't exist at each other's throats. We can't exist killing each other for whatever, whether dictated to us or not, slights or jealousies or infighting or I guess you could say cultural differences we have, or darkness is going to win out. And I really hope that, I just hope and pray that the kinslaying is done, and we don't have another horrific period of brother wars in our future, because I don't think we can survive another one. And the jury's still out whether we survive the first one.
No, thank you for that. Yeah, I very much hope no more brother wars, as the saying goes, and
because I
especially
want Germans and English and Scottish and Irish and French and the Swiss, and I want all of us to get along. I don't want us to have generations of our men exsanguinated fighting for what? For territory, for ideology? In the end, what we have is people. What we have is the culture, the civilization that we have. Now, I know that sometimes conflict and war happens, but not in this, because in my opinion, the concept of total war is something alien to Western civilization. Look at the Greeks. Go from the Greeks all the way through the Roman Empire, all the way up to, let's say, the French Revolution. The concept of total war, of having this never-ending total war, I don't really think that was a thing until it was sort of incorporated in the last 100 to 150 years into what became the GAE. Because you would have men fighting over honor, you would have soldiers going like between city-states, or the Roman Empire would roll up, or the British Empire would roll up and say, we want these resources, this is part of the Roman Empire, the British Empire now, here's how things are going to be. It wasn't a, let's create destabilization and use color revolutions to weaken a country and then enslave it and change everything about it and annihilate the ethnicity and put up a Starbucks. Like, to me, that's a kind of sick total war that didn't really happen in the way it's happening now. And I think that if we have to not do that again, because I don't think we'll have any kind of future worth living if we don't move away from this total war cultural zeitgeist stuff, where you want to have this one ideology that conquers and crushes everything and then makes it into that one thing. I think that all of that is just, it's counter to how I think we're supposed to live. What do you think about that?
No, I agree with you, because it's all just nihilistic destruction for no higher end, and all you do is weaken yourselves when there are enemies on the prowl, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, and so from there, so in the aftermath of the kinslaying, the Valar basically say to the Noldor, right, you're banished forever from Valinor for this. You're never welcome. And what actually happens as well is, I mentioned Fëanor's two brothers, Fingolfin and Finarfin. Finarfin, after this, decides we're not part of this anymore, and he and his host march back, and they are forgiven and are allowed to stay in Valinor. So you have this now permanent split in the Noldor. You have the Fëanor's Noldor, and then you have Finarfin's Noldor, and Finarfin is now the king of the Noldor in Valinor. So you've permanently split this group now.
Did Galadriel stay there with them, or did she leave with the Shund?
I believe Galadriel stays with her father Finarfin for now, but in future she does eventually go to Middle Earth. That's where she ends up. Yeah,
because I knew she ended up there eventually. I just didn't know if she left with them then or not.
And also, so Fëanor, in his arrogance, then seizes the ships and sails off, leaving behind his brother Fingolfin without any ships. And Fingolfin feels slighted, but he still feels that as his brother is his king, he still has an obligation to serve him. And what he then does is to get to Middle Earth, instead of having to sail as he's got no ships, Fingolfin marches to the very north of Valinor, where there's this very narrow stretch of land, of icy wasteland called Helcarax. And
Okay.
Helcarax links Valinor and Middle Earth.
Helcarax is a cool word. I like that word. It's cool.
Yes, it is. And so this is now image. This is Fingolfin and his host of Noldor marching through Helcarax, the grinding ice. And so again, we've got this ideas of hardy people on this sort of long trek. And the main example I think of when looking at this is those that you may think is a bit unusual, but in South African history, you've got an event called the Great Trek, or the Voortrekkers, which is when basically the South Africa originally was a Dutch colony, which the British deprive of the Dutch after the Napoleonic Wars in recompense for Britain aiding the Dutch. And as a result, all of the Boers, the Dutch settlers, decide they don't want to live under British rule, and so they all pack up everything and they march north and found a new homeland in the Boer republics of the Orange and the Transvaal.
That's a beautiful real world analogy, or not analogy, a beautiful real world parody here. Yeah.
They march north and they fight many of the tribes, such as the Zulu, in order to set up their new land. And they actually do it. They're very hardy, the Boers. They set up these two new countries before Britain would put an end to that many years later. But that's a different discussion for a different day. And one other thing, actually, that I want to mention before it slips my mind is just going back to the kinslaying. Again, we've got this idea of the Silmarillion being somehow informed by the Bible or Tolkien's Christianity, but though it's not a perfect analogy, with the kinslaying, I can't help but think of the Cain and Abel, and Cain slaying Abel.
Absolutely, yeah.
And because, of course, remember, Cain was actually banished from the land by God for that. So, okay, So Fingolfin's hosts march over to Middle Earth that way, while Fëanor sails over the seas to Middle Earth itself. And when he arrives there, he almost has an idea of there is no going back. So what his hosts do is they burn all of the Teleri ships. And
oh my God.
Yeah. This is a wonderfully destructive image and very, very bright, and I think Ted Naismith is a great artist, and he really, I think, embellishes these scenes with his art style. But yes, so not only do you have the actual banishment of the Noldor from Valinor, but they physically, do I think they do this for psychological purposes. It's almost saying that we can't go back. There's no going back. There is only forward. So, so though they are transgressive, they are still hardy. And they sort of, I kind of guess they're giving themselves a reality check. What's done is done. That there's no going back. There's only forward.
Yeah, I respect that. I respect that. Despite them being the bad guys of the story, I still respect that. I like that.
Yes, and there is another reading I want to do now that they've arrived. So let me just make sure I've got the right page. Okay. So this is from a chapter called "The Return of the Noldor." It's been told that Fëanor and his sons came first of the exiles to Middle Earth and landed in the waste of Lamoth, the great echo upon the outer shores of the Firth of Drengist. And even as the Noldor set foot upon the strand, their cries were taken up into the hills and multiplied, so that a clamour as of the countless mighty voices filled all the coast of the north, and the noise of the burning of the ships at Losgar went down the winds of the sea as a tumult of great wrath. And far away, all who heard that sound were filled with wonder. Now the flames of that burning were seen not only by Fingolfin, whom Fëanor had deserted in Araman, but also by the orcs and the watchers of Morgoth. No tale has been told what Morgoth thought in his heart at the tidings that Fëanor, his bitterest foe, had brought a host out of the west. It may be that he feared him little, for he had as yet no proof of the swords of the Noldor, and soon it was seen that he purposed to drive them back into the sea. Under the cold stars before the rising of the moon, the host of Fëanor went up to the long firth of the Drengist, that pierced the echoing hills of Ered Lomin, and passed thus from the shores into the great land of Hithlum, and they came at least to the long lake of Mithrim, and upon its northern shore made their encampment in the region that bore the same name, But the host of Morgoth, aroused by the tumult of Lamoth and the light of the burning at Losgar, came through the passes of Ered Wefrin, the mountains of shadow, and assailed Fëanor on a sudden before his camp was full wrought or put in defence. And there on the grey fields of Mithrim was fought the second battle in the wars of Beleriand, Daegor Nuin Gileath, it is named, the battle under stars, for the moon had not yet risen, and it is renowned in song. The Noldor, outnumbered and taken at unawares, were not yet swiftly victorious, for the light of Aman was not yet dimmed in their eyes, and they were strong and swift, and deadly in anger, and their swords were long and terrible. The orcs fled before them, and they were driven forth from Mithrim with great slaughter, and hunted over the mountains of shadow into the great plain of Ardgalen that lay northward of Dorthonion. There the armies of Morgoth that had passed south into the Vale of Sirion and beleaguered Círdan in the havens of Philas came up to their aid, and were caught in their ruin, for Celegorm, Fëanor's son, having news of them, waylaid them with a part of the elven host, and coming down upon them out of the hills near Eifel Sirion, drove them into the fen of Serek. Even indeed were the tidings that came at last to Angband, and Morgoth was dismayed. 10 days that battle lasted, and from it returned of all the hosts that he had prepared for the conquest of Beleriand, and no more than a handful of leaves. Yet cause he had for great joy, though it was hidden from him for a while, for Fëanor, in his wrath against the enemy, would not halt, but pressed on behind the remnant of the orcs, thinking so to come at Morgoth himself, and he laughed aloud as he wielded his sword, rejoicing that he had dared the wrath of the Valar and the evils of the road, that he might see the hour of his vengeance. Nothing did he know of Angband, or of the great strength of defence that Morgoth had so swiftly prepared, but even that he had known it would not have deterred him, for he was fey, consumed by the flame of his own wrath. Thus it was that he drew far ahead of the van of his host, and seeing that the servants of Morgoth turned to bay, and there issued from Angband Balrogs to aid them. Thereupon the confines of Dor Daedaloth, the lands of Morgoth, Fëanor was surrounded, and with few friends about him, long he fought on, and undismayed, though he was wrapped in fire, and wounded with many wounds, that at the last he was smitten to the ground by Gothmog, lord of the Balrogs, whom Ecthelion after slew in Gondolin. There he would have perished, had not his sons in that moment came up and with force to his aid, and the Balrogs left him and departed to Angband. Then his sons raised up their father and bore him back towards Mithrim, but as they drew near to Eifel Sirion and were upon the upward path to the pass over the mountains, Fëanor bade them to halt, for his wounds were mortal, and he knew that his hour was come. And looking out from the slopes of Ered Wefrin with his last sight, he beheld far off the peaks of Fangorodrim, mightiest of the towers of Middle-earth, and knew with the foreknowledge of death that no power of the Noldor would ever overthrow them. But he cursed the name of Morgoth thrice, and laid it upon his sons to hold on to their oath and to avenge their father. Then he died, but he had neither burial nor tomb, for so fiery was his spirit that as it sped his body fell to ash, and was borne away like smoke, and his likeness has never again appeared in Arda, neither has his spirit left the halls of Mandos. Thus ended the mightiest of the Noldor, of whose deeds came both their greatest renown and their most grievous woe. So in that passage, we have the death of Fëanor at the hands of Morgoth's forces, and yes, we can clearly see he was obviously of a great wrathful and fiery spirit, but though that led him obviously to great creative work such as making the Silmarils and being a leader of his people, it also led to his doom and downfall as he has alienated himself from the other elves, from the gods, and now here he is dying.
Because he took, and not only that, he took so many of his people to a dangerous, hostile place, and they followed him because of his passion and his conviction. But it's also showing how that also has a dark side, and how if you give in to that too much, it's a good cautionary tale, I think.
And something else I should mention is the etymology. So obviously, Tolkien came up with his own languages, but in the Elven language of Sindarin, Fëanor means spirit of fire. So a very fitting end for him to burn away in his own wrath.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
And it's interesting because Apostolic Majesty has a series of streams on his channel going into the Silmarillion in a lot more depth than we're going to go into. And there's an analogy he came up with, which I think is quite good, is Fëanor as some kind of Achilles-like figure, this great warrior of extreme wrath, who then falls possibly at what could have been his greatest moments.
Yeah.
And
It's a beautiful story. I don't have any particular commentary about that, I suppose, other than what I've already shared. I do think just general energy from that story is, to me, it says, I don't know. On the one hand, I do think it's important to follow and be loyal to the best and the most motivated and the most powerful of your people. But on the other hand, perhaps it also tells us that maybe his sons, maybe those most loyal to him, somewhere along the way should have cautioned him against this never-ending crusade for his own glory and his own powerful energy. It's a difficult line to walk, because you want your king, your leader, your ruler to be someone who will make bold, dangerous decisions and do bold, dangerous things when the time is right. But I guess that's the immortal question, isn't it? When is the time right for that? When is the time for war? When is the time for peace? When is the time to split from your people and go? When is the time to stay and try to make things better? It's not an easy answer, is it?
No, and obviously with the death of Fëanor, the leadership of the Noldor passes to his eldest son Medros, and in the aftermath of this battle, Medros is actually captured, and he's taken to. So just to clarify, the name Angband came up a lot. So Angband is Morgoth's fortress in the north of this. So another thing I've got to mention is that Middle-earth's geography is a bit different in this ancient age. There's an extra landmass in the northwest called Beleriand, which is later sunk into the sea. But in the north of Beleriand is this fortress called Angband, which is Morgoth's home, so to speak. So it's a bit like his equivalent of Mordor, basically. And
that's where the mud Angband gets its not mud. That's where the roguelike. It might be a mud. Where the roguelike Angband gets its name, I'm sure.
Oh, really? I didn't know there was one. And yes, and as you heard there,
my husband and his friends really like stuff like that. They're into like muds and roguelikes and text adventures and stuff. They like Dwarf Fortress, and so I get to hear a lot about that. And I know that there's a big, I think it's a mud, a big roguelike called Angband.
And yes, and Fangor-Rodrim is this giant tower that sort of erects out of Angband, and it's at Fangor-Rodrim that Medros is bound to and kept as a prisoner for a while. And now things are going to get a little bit more light-hearted, as what happens is Fingolfin finally arrives, and his host try to rescue Medros, and then it's one of his sons, I think it's his eldest son, Fingon, goes to Angband to try and free Medros, and he asks for aid from Manwë, the Valar of the Sky, and Manwë sends one of his eagles to help Finrod find Medros, and so he's flying around Fangor-Rodrim, and he decides to engage in an elvish song, and Medros replies in kind, finishing the sentence, so to speak, and that's how Finrod is able to find his cousin, and he frees him. Though unfortunately, because he's unable to free him, he has to cut Medros off at the wrist. So Medros is forever crippled from that point, unfortunately. And so grateful is Medros for being freed is that he passes the leadership of the Noldor to Finrod's father, Fingolfin. So Fingolfin goes on to become the High King of the Noldor, and it is quite nice because you're seeing a mending of these two different houses of the Noldor, the House of Fëanor and the House of Fingolfin, because I mentioned earlier that there'd been some tension where Fëanor didn't quite trust his brother, but through all that tragedy, they've managed to work out their differences. And okay, is there any other comment you want to add on the back of that, or?
Oh no, I for this part specifically, no. It's a beautiful part of the story. I don't. When it comes to anything that I could add for Appalachian cultural history here, there is a trope associated with Appalachia called family feuds. It's where the game show gets its name, Family Feud. That might be the only thing that people will be familiar with outside of America that has that. And family feuding happened a lot in the 17 and 1800s in Appalachia, where one big family clan would have a particular grievance, perhaps over a marriage, perhaps over a marriage that fell apart, perhaps over something territorial like farmland or good bottom land, something like that. And there would be these generational frustrations. And then eventually, two noble people of those families would meet and bury the hatchet and put their family grievances aside, and those clans would be healed and stronger for that. And that's what this reminds me of for my personal cultural history.
Oh, thank you. And the idea of a family feud, no, that makes me think of obviously if you go back to the Anglo-Saxon period of English history, you've got the idea of the blood feud, because
Mhm.
that was I believe that's probably the origin of what you're talking about.
Oh, certainly. Yeah.
These are, well, not just Anglo-Saxons, but most Germanic peoples had these blood feuds, and not even just the Germanics, because I've been reading a lot of Arab history recently, and the blood feud is something that's completely inseparable from Arab culture, because they are a very bloodthirsty and vengeful people, especially when they've been slighted. So
I can relate. That's how I feel too. I got to keep that in check though. You can't let your darker, more violent emotions be in the driver's seat all the time. You have to be very careful when you let those have the driver's seat, because sometimes it's difficult to get them out of that seat.
And I just want to address this comment from Nami El Kazan. It's beautiful how Tolkien takes a bit of history and woven them to create such an amazing story. It is, he's an absolutely wonderful writer, fully
Yeah.
deserving of his reputation.
I agree. And I don't listen to all of Apostolic Majesty's content, but I've listened to some of the Silmarillion ones. I could listen to him forever. I love his voice. I love his content. I think he is a very gifted history and literature autist, and we are all blessed to have him and his content.
And yes, I absolutely agreed. Everybody needs to watch and listen to Apostolic Majesty. Okay. And okay. So things are with the next part of the Tale of the Noldor. So after Fingolfin becomes king, the Noldor are able to settle down and found their own realms in Beleriand, and things passed on over the centuries, and there's many struggles and skirmishes between the forces of the Noldor and the other elves against the forces of Morgoth. But this does culminate in quite a one of my most favourite scenes in the Silmarillion, but also I think one of great sadness and tragedy, which is the death of Fingolfin. So with this, I'm going to do another reading. So this is from a chapter called Of the Ruin of Beleriand and the Fall of Fingolfin. So now Fingolfin, king of the north and the high king of the Noldor, seeing that his people were become numerous and strong, and that the men allied to them were many and valiant, pondered once more an assault upon Angband. For he knew that they lived in danger, while the circle of the siege was incomplete, and Morgoth was free to labour in his deep mines, devising what evils none could foretell ere he should reveal them. This counsel was wise according to the measure of his knowledge, for the Noldor did not yet comprehend the fullness of the power of Morgoth, nor understand that their unaided war upon him was without final hope, whether they hasted or delayed. But because the land was fair and their kingdoms wide, most of the Noldor were content with things as they were, trusting them to last, and so to begin an assault in which many must surely perish, were it in victory or in defeat. Therefore, they were little disposed to hearken to Fingolfin, and the sons of Fëanor at that time least of all. Among the chieftains of the Noldor, Angrod and Egnor alone were of like mind with the king, for they dwelt in regions whence Fangorrodrim could be descried, and the threat of Morgoth was present to their thoughts. Thus the designs of Fingolfin came to naught, and the land had peace yet for a while. But when the sixth generation of men after Beor and Marak were not yet come to full manhood, it being then 400 years and 55 since the coming of Fingolfin, the evil befell that he had long dreaded, and yet more dire and sudden than his darkest fear. For Morgoth had long prepared his force in secret, and while ever the malice of his heart grew greater, and his hatred of the Noldor more bitter, and he desired not only to end his foes, but to destroy also, and defile the lands that they had taken and made fair, and it is said that his hate overcame his counsel, so that if he had but endured to wait longer until his designs were full, then the Noldor would have perished utterly. But on his part he esteemed too lightly the valour of the elves, and of men he took yet no account. There came a time of winter, when night was dark and without moon, and the wide plain of Ardgalen stretched dim beneath the cold stars, from the hill forts of the Noldor to the feet of Fangorodrim. The watchfires burned low, and the guards were few. On the plain few were waking in the camps of the horsemen of Hithlum. Then suddenly Morgoth sent forth great rivers of flame that ran down swifter than bullrogs from Fangorodrim, and poured over all the plain, and the mountains of iron belched forth fires of many poisonous hues, and the fume of them stank upon the air, and was deadly. Thus Ardgalen perished, and fires devoured its grasses, and it became a burned and desolate waste, full of choking dust, barren and lifeless. Thereafter its name was changed, and it was called Angfauglyph, the grasping dust. Many charred bones had their roofless graves, but many of the Noldor perished in that burning, who were caught by the running flame and could not fly to the hills. The heights of Dorthonion and Ered Wefrin held back the fiery torrents, but the woods upon the slopes that looked toward Angband were all kindled, and the smoke wrought confusion among the defenders. Thus began the fourth of the great battles, Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of the Southern Flame. In the front of that fire came Glaurung the Golden, father of dragons. In his full might and in his train were bullrogs, and behind them came the black armies of orcs in multitudes such as the Noldor had never before seen or imagined. And they assaulted the fortresses of the Noldor, and broke the leaguer about Angband, and slew wherever they found them the Noldor and their allies, grey elves and men. Many of the stoutest of the foes of Morgoth were destroyed in the first days of that war, bewildered and dispersed, and unable to muster their strength. War ceased not wholly ever again in Beleriand, but the Battle of the Southern Flame is held to have ended with the coming of spring, when the onslaught of Morgoth grew less. Thus ended the siege of Angband, and the foes of Morgoth were scattered and sundered from one another. The most part of the great elves fled south and forsook the northern war. Many were received into Doriath, and the kingdom and strength of Thingol grew greater in that time. For the power of Melian the queen was woven about his borders, and evil could not yet enter that hidden realm. Others took refuge in the fortresses by the sea and in Nargothrond, and some fled the land and hid themselves in Osiriand, or passing the mountains wandered homeless in the wild. And the rumour of the war and the breaking of the siege reached the ears of men in the east of Middle-earth. The sons of Finarfin bore most heavily the brunt of the assault, and Angrod and Agnor were slain. Beside them fell Bregalas, the lord of the house of Bjor, and the great part of the warriors of that people. But Barahir, the brother of Bregalas, was in the fighting further westward, near the pass of Sirion. There King Finrod Felagund, hastening from the south, was cut off from his people, and surrounded with small company in the fen of Serek. He would have been slain or taken, but Barahir came up with the bravest of his men, and rescued him, and made a wall of spears about him, and they cut their way out of battle with great loss. Thus Felagund escaped, and returned to keep his deep fortress of Nargothrond, but he swore an oath of abiding friendship, and in aid in every need to Barahir and all his kin. And in token of his vow, he gave to Barahir his ring. Barahir was now by right lord of the house of Beor, and he returned to Dorthonion, but most of his people fled from their homes and took refuge in the fastness of Hithlum. So great was the onslaught of Morgoth that Fingolfin and Fingon could not come to the aid of the sons of Finarfin and the hosts of Hithlum, and were driven back with great loss to the fortresses of Ered Wefrin, and these they hardly defended against the orcs. Before the walls of Eithel Sirion fell Hador the golden-haired, defending the rearguard of his lord Fingolfin, being then 66 years of age, and with him fell Gundor his younger son, pierced with many arrows, and they were mourned by the elves. Then Geldor the Tall took the lordship of his father, and because of the strength and height of the shadowy mountains which withstood the torrent of fire, by the valour of the elves and the men of the north, which neither Orc nor Balrog could yet overcome, Hithlum remained unconquered, a threat upon the flank of Morgoth's attack. But Fingolfin was sundered from his kinsmen by a sea of foes. For the war had gone ill with the sons of Fëanor, and well nigh all the east marches were taken by assault. The pass of Aglog was forced, through which a great cost to the houses of Morgoth, and Celegor and Cirithyn, being defeated, fled south and west by the marches of Doriath, and coming at last to Nargothrond, sought harbour with Finrod Felagund. Thus it came to pass that their people swelled the strength of Nargothrond, but it would have been better, as had been seen, if they had remained in the east among their own kin. Nedros did deeds of surpassing valour, and the orcs fled before his face, for since his torment upon Fangogodrim, his spirit burned like a white fire within, and he was at one that returns from the dead. Thus the great fortress upon the hill of Himring could not be taken, and many of the most valiant that remained, both the people of Dorthonion and of the East Marches, rallied there to Medros, and for a while he closed once more the pass of Aglon, so that the orcs could not enter Beleriand by that road, but they overwhelmed the riders of the pass of people of Fëanor upon Lothlan. For Glaurung came thither and passed through Maglor's Gap, and destroyed all the land between the arms of Gelion, and the orcs took the fortress upon the west slopes of Mount Rerir, and ravaged all Forgalion, the land of Caranthir, and they defiled Lake Helivon. Thence they passed over Gelion with fire and terror, and came far into East Beleriand. Maglor joined Medros upon Himring, but Caranthir fled and joined the remnant of his people to the scattered folk of the hunters, Amrod and Amras, and they retreated and passed Ramdul in the south. Upon Amon Ereb they maintained a watch and some strength of war, and they had the aid of the green elves, and the orcs came not into Osiriand, nor to Tar Im Duineth and the wilds of the south. So from that bit I've read, you can see that this Battle of the Southern Flame, or this great battle, absolutely devastates the lands of Beleriand, and many of the Noldor are driven off their land as it's burned and corrupted. Though in that darkness, and we do see a glimmer of light as a kinship is formed between Beor, this man, and Finrod Felagund, because he saves Finrod's life in battle, and Finrod there pledges an oath saying that I will one day repay this oath to you, which he does, because many years later, there's another story in the Silmarillion called The Tale of Beren and Luthien, and in the story, Beren is a descendant of Beor, and he asks aid from Finrod to help him acquire Silmaril, and Finrod dies in service to Beren, thereby fulfilling the oath he had given to his ancestor many years before. So there is death and destruction. There is ultimately survival and a sort of a rekindling of ties of friendship, ultimately.
And go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to ask you, it was hard for me to follow all of that, because these words, it's hard for me to keep all straight in my head, because every sentence is laden with words I don't really understand because I've not studied it. The artwork here, when the armies of orcs made these elves break the first time, and then later in what you read, when they moved through taking and destroying land and pushing back the elves, forcing that instance of bonding between elf and man there. Is that push when Fingolfin faces Morgoth and is destroyed?
Yes, so that is what basically Fingolfin's like, I've had enough, and now I want to read of Fingolfin's wrath and the duel with Morgoth. So
okay, all right.
Yeah. Now news came to Hithlum that Dorthonion was lost, and the sons of Finarfin overthrown, and that the sons of Fëanor were driven from their lands. Then Fingolfin beheld, as it seemed to him, the utter ruin of the Noldor, and the defeat beyond redress of all their houses, and filled with wrath and despair, he mounted upon Rocallor, his great horse, and rode forth alone, and none might restrain him. He passed over Dor New Falglith like a wind amid the dust, and all that beheld his onset fled in amaze, thinking that Arome himself was come, for a great madness of rage was upon him, so that his eyes shone like the eyes of the Valar. Thus he came alone to Angband's gates, and he sounded his horn, and he smote once more upon the brazen doors, and challenged Morgoth to come forth to single combat, and Morgoth came. And that was the last time in those wars that he passed the doors of his stronghold, and it is said that he took not the challenge willingly, for though his might was greatest of all things in the world, alone of the Valar he knew fear, but he could not now deny the challenge before the face of his captains, for the rocks rang with the shrill music of Fingolfin's horn, and his voice came keen and clear down into the depths of Angband, and Fingolfin named Morgoth Craven and Lord of Slaves. Therefore Morgoth came, climbing slowly from his subterranean throne, and the rumour of his feet was like thunder underground. And he issued forth clad in black armour, and he stood before the king like a tower, iron-crowned, and his vast shield, sable and blazoned, cast a shadow over him like a storm cloud. But Fingolfin gleamed beneath it as a star, for his mail was overlaid with silver, and his blue shield was set with crystals, and he drew his sword Ringel that glittered like ice. Then Morgoth hurled aloft Grond, the hammer of the underworld, and swung it down like a bolt of thunder. But Fingolfin sprang aside, and Grond rent a mighty pit in the earth, whence smoke and fire darted. Many times Morgoth essayed to smite him, and each time Fingolfin leaped away, as a lightning shoots from under a dark cloud, and he wounded Morgoth with 7 wounds, and 7 times Morgoth gave a cry of anguish, whereat the hosts of Angband fell upon their faces in dismay, and the cries echoed in the Northlands. But at the last the king grew weary, and Morgoth bore down his shield upon him. Thrice he was crushed to his knees, and thrice arose again, and bore up his broken shield and stricken helm. But the earth was all rent and pitted about him, and he stumbled and fell backward before the feet of Morgoth. And Morgoth set his left foot upon his neck, and the weight of it was like a fallen hill. Yet with his last and desperate stroke, Fingolfin hewed the foot with Ringel, and the blood gushed forth black and smoking and filled the pits of Grond. Thus died Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, most proud and valiant of the elven kings of old. The orcs made no boast of that duel at the gate, neither do the elves sing of it, for their sorrow is too deep. Yet the tale that it is remembered still, for Thorondor, King of Eagles, brought the tidings to Gondolin, and to Hiflem afar off, and Morgoth took the body of the elven king and broke it, and would cast it to his wolves. But Thorondor came hasting from his eyrie among the peaks of the Crisagrim, and he swooped upon Morgoth and marred his face. The rushing of the wings of Thorondor was like the noise of the winds of Manwë, and he seized the body in his mighty talons, and soaring suddenly above the darts of the orcs, he bore the king away. And he laid him upon a mountain top that looked from the north upon the hidden valley of Gondolin, and Turgon, coming, built a nigh cairn over his father. No orc dared ever after to pass over the mount of Fingolfin, or draw nigh his tomb, until the doom of Gondolin was come, and the treachery was born among his kin. Morgoth went ever halt Morgoth went ever halt of 1 foot after that day, and the pain of his wounds could not be healed, and in his face was the scar that Thorondir made. Great was the lamentation in Hiflem when the fall of Fingolfin became known, and Fingon in sorrow took the lordship of the house of Fingolfin and the kingdom of the Noldor, but his young son Iranian, who was named after Gil-galad, he sent to the Havens. So very sad there, the death of Fingolfin, though a very, very brave challenge he gave to Morgoth there. And what's even more fascinating is that Morgoth is permanently crippled after this fight with Fingolfin, which is amazing because he is the eldest of the Valar, the eldest and arguably the most powerful of the children of Eru Ilúvatar. So,
and that's why they said the last of the real elven kings died there, because he was the last of the divine-blooded elves that came to Middle Earth, right?
Oh no, absolutely. Yes. So. And just to give a bit more information, Thorondor is one of the elves of Manwë, the Valar of the Sky. So again, he comes in and wounds Morgoth and comes away with the corpse.
And since Fingolfin's divinely blessed sword is of the same energy, that's why it was able to deal a permanent wound to Morgoth, and that's why the claws of the divine eagle could permanently wound him too, right? Because that divine or mythic energy is what is like the only way to permanently wound Morgoth. Is that what we're to take from that?
Yes, no, absolutely. And here with this image, you've got Turgon. So he's the younger son of Fingolfin. He sets up this funeral cairn outside the hidden city of Gondolin because realizing how bad things are for the Noldor, Turgon, with the aid of Ulmo, the Valar of Water, is able to set up this hidden city of Gondolin in this valley, which is hidden from Morgoth's view, and it manages to survive many generations, unfortunately, until it falls to treachery, as one of the elves of Maeglin, basically, who's I hate to use this word, but he's a bit of an incel, and because he can't get the elven woman he loves, he betrays the Noldor, because the elven woman he loves is the daughter of Turgon. And because he can't have her hand, he betrays the Noldor to Morgoth. And
what a horrible, horrible person he was.
Yes, and here we see the flight of the Noldor from Gondolin after its destruction. And just a couple of things to comment, sort of drawing on some wider themes in Tolkien. So the treachery of Maeglin, we see this echoed with Grima Wormtongue in the Lord of the Rings, betraying the kingdom of Rohan. So, and again, you know, you know, may the traitor forever be damned, because it is utterly, I think, one of the. There's a reason why in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, in his Inferno, where he's traveling through hell, traitors are like the final level of hell. It's where people
Yeah,
like you know, Brutus and Cassius are, because it's such an evil, wrong thing to do, to
I
betray your
agree.
lord, or betray your king in such a way.
Hmm. Betraying your people, betraying your kin, betraying your basically betraying your society, if you want to use a more modern term. But I think that is one of the most egregious evil sins that somebody can commit.
No, because ultimately you should have loyalty amongst all others. And I mean, and when I say loyalty, I don't mean blindingly being
Right.
uncritical, because that's what the Teleri did. They rightfully challenged Fëanor and the Noldor on what they were doing. But
Yeah.
there's a difference between being critical and then just utter treason for selfish purposes.
Right. Or
And
if not selfish purposes, just spiteful purposes. Like the story that you told me about the betrayal here, um, it it wasn't just he was angry. It was more than that. It was uglier than that. Like he you brought up incel, but the fact that he couldn't have what he wanted to bring ruin and destruction to everything. That's like that's like an epic level version of childish frustration of I can't have ice cream I want right now, so I'm going to stomp my feet and smash this thing on the floor. Like it's such an ugly, debased um, pettiness and evil. It's a very brutal primal evil to say I can't have what I want, so I want the world to burn. Like it's a very despicable thing.
no, no, absolutely. And yeah, so despite all this destruction, there is a bit of a happy ending, because Turgon marries his daughter to a human champion called Tuor, and Tuor flees, and he has a son with Turgon's daughter called Erendil. He's a half-elven mariner, and he goes on a great odyssey. And this is something Apostolic Majesty comments as well, that
Huh?
Erendil's story is obviously, I think we can draw some allegory to the Odyssey, or even the Aeneid, these ancient classical works, these
Hmm.
great heroes' journeys, so to speak. And
Okay.
Erendil goes to Valinor, and he beseeches the Valar,
And
and
being
the
half
Valar.
elven is sort of like in the real world Earth mythology, how you have demigods or the heroes of these of Iliads and Odysseys and things are often blessed by divinities or part divinity themselves, and so there's parity there.
Yes, of course, and yeah, so he's able, because he marries an elven woman, and Erendil is able to beseech the Valar for aid, and the Valar decide, after all of, though they damn the Noldor, they've decided Morgoth has gone on too far. He's caused so much destruction, so all of the Valar and Ilúvatar come to Middle Earth, and they defeat Morgoth. They bind him in this great chain. Because sorry, something I forgot to mention is Morgoth, when he fled and has the Silmarils, he fashions an iron crown, in which he puts in the Silmarils, and he wears that on his head the whole time. And
Okay.
what happens is when the Valar defeat him, they tear off his iron crown and they force it around him like a belt or a girdle, and they remove the Silmarils, and think, from my understanding, he's basically stuck in some kind of purgatory for the rest of like history, essentially.
Some type of like divine imprisonment where it's
Yeah.
it's like he sinks to the middle of the earth, but like that's sort of just metaphysical. He's divinely imprisoned in a place where he can't physically get to the real world anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that's
And
the way I understood the story from just absorbing Tolkien fiction most of my life. Morgoth is it's not like he's in a dungeon you can go physically get to, right? Like he's divinely imprisoned by this epic event.
yeah, that's what I would say. And there's this
Okay.
it's left vague by Tolkien, but there's a possibility that as he's imprisoned, it's possible for Morgoth to return. So that's ever a
Okay.
danger. And when we get to Lord of the Rings, and we've got Sauron, what you must remember is that Sauron is a Maya, so he's a level of divine being below Morgoth. Morgoth is a Valar, Sauron is a Maya, And
Okay.
Sauron was, interestingly, he's a Maya of Aule, the Valor of Craft, which is why he's able to fashion the rings, because he's essentially
Right.
a craftsman being, and that's his
Hmm.
expertise. And Sauron is actually defects to Morgoth and is his chief captain or lieutenant, and that's why he sort of takes up the mantle of the big bad guy after Morgoth's
Right.
imprisonment.
Hmm.
And yeah, we're going to wrap up shortly, but I just want to very quickly talk about another part of the Silmarillion called the Akelabeth, which is the downfall of Númenor. So what
Okay.
happens after Morgoth's defeat? And I mentioned Erendil there. Well,
Hmm.
Erendil has two sons, Elrond and Elros, both half elven. And what's interesting with how being half elven works is that Manwë gives to the half elves, you can choose to be either elven or human. I take everything that comes with that. And so Elrond chooses to be elven, and that is the Elrond of the Lord of the Rings, the father of Arwen.
Right.
And Elros, his brother, chooses to be human, and he is made the first king of Númenor. And Númenor is this island kingdom that is created by Ilúvatar in the War Sea between Middle Earth and Valinor. And the
And I know
Númenorians.
that because I've read the Lord of the Rings. That's what that's the original ancestor that gives Aragorn his special birthright.
Yes, the blood of the Númenorians. And the
Right.
Númenorians have this island kingdom that's created for them, and they rule for centuries. And it's actually with the creation of Númenor and the imprisonment of Morgoth, it's the beginning of what's called the Second Age, because the First Age begins in the aftermath when the trees are destroyed, because Yavanna, the Valar, she creates the sun and the moon to enlighten the earth after the darkness, because those early years are called the years of the trees. You then have the First Age and then the Second Age, and so on and so forth. And so,
Can I ask you a question about the mythology here? Do you mind?
sure, yeah.
The sun and the moon that brings light to the world again. Are those the two Samarils that are let free when they when they break the crown of Morgoth and bind him with it? Do those become the sun and the moon in the mythology? Because that would be
Um,
nice if they did that. I don't know.
it would be nice, but it's not. No. What
That's not what I have.
happens
Okay.
is, yeah. So the sun and moon are created shortly, not that long after the destruction of the trees. And what
Okay.
actually happens with the Silmarils is that I mentioned Fëanor's sons, because some of his sons are still alive by this point, all these centuries
Okay.
later. And he's only two of the sons actually survived the wars with Morgoth, Merdros and I think the other one's called Curufin, I can't remember, but two sons survive. And after Morgoth is defeated and the Iron Crown is destroyed, they try to take the Silmarils for themselves. And everyone else is just like, no, after everything, you're still going to cling to this ancient oath. And these two remaining sons of Fëanor are so shamed by this that Merdros takes his Silmaril and he commits suicide. He throws himself into the earth, where he is smothered by the deep fire within the earth. So he and the Silmaril are smothered. And the other son goes off and casts his Silmaril into the sea. And then he wanders the rest of his life in a kind of depressed grief and melancholy, sort of reflecting on his deeds.
Okay.
And the other Silmaril is dealt with in the tale of Beren and Lúthien. Beren is able to steal the Silmaril from Morgoth's Iron Crown in order to give it as a dowry to the Elven King Fingon, so he can marry his daughter Lúthien. And what Fingon then does is that he hires these dwarves to try and create this new crown out of the Silmaril, but he also wants them to use some dwarven artifacts he's found, and the dwarves aren't too happy about that, and this leads to a struggle and the death of Fingon when these dwarves murder him, essentially.
Okay.
And yeah.
So the Silmarils, do they vary in size like some mythological objects, which are more of just an expression of thought and purpose, or are they always codified as like a certain size or shape of thing with certain properties? I'm just curious because I don't know.
Well, the three jewels, they're about the same size. Think they're like a jewel that can fit in the palm of your hand. It can fit in
Okay.
your palm, but they're quite large and they're beautiful
Okay.
because they're filled with the light of the two trees. And so,
Okay.
yes, there's obviously that they're divinely made and inspired, but ultimately they're still material jewels. And
Okay.
and I think the whole lesson of the Silmarillion is, yes, all of this death and destruction that's fought over them is ultimately terrible, because all
Yeah.
these people die when it's, you really should focus on your own people and your survival and your culture and traditions, and not some bloody jewels, essentially.
Shiny things are nice, but don't end your civilization over them.
No, exactly. And yeah, just to again quickly go back to the downfall of Numenor. So the kingdom is established, and it lasts the entire Second Age. But with the downfall of Numenor, this happens with their final king, Ar-Pharazôn. So Ar-Pharazôn hears that Sauron is causing trouble in Umbar, the land south of Gondor, and he goes there to deal with Sauron and to take over. And Sauron willingly goes into his captivity. And while he's in Numenor, Sauron, let's just say he whispers sweet evils into Ar-Pharazôn's ear. And like Morgoth with Fëanor before, he corrupts Ar-Pharazôn over time and says, because one thing that's important to remember is that Eru Ilúvatar and the Valar have banned men from ever stepping forth in Valinor. Only elves can go to Valinor.
Right.
And Ar-Pharazôn thinks, well, why can't we go to Valinor? And what Sauron does is that he whispers these sweet evils and convinces the Númenóreans to abandon the faith of Eru Ilúvatar and the Valar and start to worship Melkor, Morgoth. So yes, and from here things deteriorate until Ar-Pharazôn, in his arrogance, assembles a mighty fleet. And as a warning to this, Manwë sends these rather doom-laden images in the sky. You've got these great haunting eagles.
That's beautiful artwork. Oh my goodness! Wow, this Ted Nesmith guy is awesome.
He is, and so essentially the saying that, I know what you're thinking, Ar-Pharazôn, don't try it. We will punish you if you transgress. And Ar-Pharazôn does so anyway. So he gets this giant fleet and he sails directly for Valinor and lands with his army. And when he lands, the whole land just swallows and destroys them. And then we have the destruction of Numenor. So two things happen. One, a great flood completely starts to drown and smother the island, genociding the whole population. And also a great kind of firestorm engulfs the island as well. So here is the great wave that smothers Numenor. And here we have Ar-Pharazôn's wife, Tarmiriel, as she's about to meet her death at the hands of the great wave.
Yeah, it's sad.
And then we've got the ships of the faithful. So what happens is Elendil, the son of Ar-Pharazôn, and his sons Isildur and I forget the name of the other son, they realise what's happening, and they prepare several days beforehand, but they assemble their own host and they flee Numenor just as everything goes to pot, essentially. And you can see the destruction of the land in the back there.
And so somewhere in these ships would be the people who would be Aragorn's ancestors, right? The survivors of this?
Exactly, because I mentioned Elendil. Elendil and Isildur obviously fight at the War of the Last Alliance and against Sauron along Elrond. And so they go and found the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. And yes, and it is the line from which Aragorn is descended from.
Okay.
But something I just want to add, again, I can't help but think of the Book of Genesis with this story. And, you've got the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the great floods when God says, the world's full of evil people, so I'm just going to wipe out everyone, and then you've got to rebuild once the great flood is gone.
And it's a good collection of cautionary tales, inspiration, the things that you've covered here today. I think it's important for us to, and the reason why I made my social media post today, I said not only is fantasy awesome, but it's important to our cultural history, and it's for reasons like this. I think that everyone needs to sort of understand things on a bigger scale, because most of us are never going to be kings and warriors and people that lead thousands of men. Most of us aren't that way, but we need to understand the energy and the connection of purpose between God, king, the ruled, the people that are enslaved, and all the fallout that can happen when those things at the top of the chain screw up and make horrible decisions, because we all suffer for it for generations. So that's like, not only can it be inspirational, it's good cautionary tales of why we need to hold each other and those who rule us to be as moral and as just as we can, or else this crap happens.
Yes, you annoy God and he destroys your civilization in punishment.
Yeah.
So
Or you listen to the whispers of Morgoth and look what happens. You get
no,
look what happens. You've got the forever war machine and the brother wars and things dying and your leaders being corrupt, selfish men of evil. So you have to you gotta do better than this. You have to aspire to be better than this.
no, absolutely, and yeah, that's everything I wanted to really go over from the Silmarillion. You know, you've got the long story of the Noldor, and then of course very briefly there we've got the downfall of Numenor, which is
Mhm.
again strong cautionary tales. No, love your people, love your. I was about to say love your leaders, but only love your leaders if they're not corrupt, treasonous snakes like our leaders are.
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's an interesting time we live in when we have the ability as a pleb to plumb the depths of literary history, religion, spiritualism, mythology, and then try to embrace that as the lowest people in society with the least power. It's an interesting time we live in where we're able to have the luxury to talk and think on these things where, in times past we didn't. And I hope that from all that we talk, like the thousands of us, maybe even the millions of us that are on social media, online, making content, talking about this, I hope that something positive grows from this, that we have some new spirit of Western people that takes us towards a better age instead of just degenerating towards this fruitless warfare and misery. I hope and pray for that every day. I really hope that we can that the things we talk about and what we do matters and helps lead our people and our civilization towards a brighter future. And I think I'll leave that as my final statement on all this today. Love your people, love your kin, speak truth and speak wisdom like we covered here today to your children, to your cousins, to your family, and hopefully it'll matter. We have to carry this positive, wise spirit and history we have through mythology. It's an important kernel of what makes us unique, of what makes us the most successful, beautiful civilization the world's ever known. We can't let that die. We have to carry that forward.
No, we have to carry the torch, so to speak, and cultivate a better generation and class of leaders. Because
Hmm.
I'm going to very quickly bring up Frank Herbert's Dune because I believe you're familiar with that, and I've
Oh,
actually done a stream
yes.
on it. I've done a stream on this channel, and one of the things that runs through that Dune is the responsibility of leaders when you have followers, because you're a leader and even though it's interesting because you've got this paradox. Yes, you're a leader and your followers will follow you if they strongly believe in you, but also at the same time, sometimes leaders are driven by their followers, and your sons can be pressured into doing things you
Hmm.
really don't want to. Like Paul is forever dreading, there's going to be a jihad. I don't want the jihad, but my followers want the jihad.
Yeah. And it's not easy. When it comes to life and culture and civilization, it's the most complex thing that there is. And we all should care and we should do what we can within our scope of existence, within our short lifespan, and with the few people that we can personally influence. That's why it's so important to be noble and to speak wisdom and truth and decency as much as you can and instill this positive energy and this beauty into as many of the minds and hearts of our people as we can, because I think that's what we need more than anything.
No, thank you for that, Yizz. And I just want to address this comment from Nami Kazan again. The Appalachian culture feels like a Magian hideout in the West. Oh, that
Yeah.
reminds me of the stream I had with Hunger on Magian civilization and
Yeah.
the concept of Appalachistan.
Yeah. There's a fun meme I like to share where it says, seeing how things went in Afghanistan. It says Appalachians when they learn what happened in Afghanistan. And it's I forget the character's name, but it's this is how I win with the cigarette. But no, it's true. I think that, and it's not just Appalachians. I'm sure that there are ethnic clusters of people all throughout Europe and North America that still have this energy, that still have this ethnic feeling of purpose and roots deep connected to our different branches of Western civilization. I'm sure that they exist outside of Appalachia too. And it's important that we hold on to that and cultivate that and grow it. We can't just hold on to it jealously. we have to build it because it has to be grown. It doesn't matter how great of a crop you have. If you're not reseeding and cultivating, it's going to die out. So we have to be that way with our own people, with our own spirit.
No, thank you for that Yizz. And well, that is the end of the stream. Thank you for everybody for watching and commenting. This has been incredibly cozy, and I feel slightly more optimistic about the future now. So thank you, Yizz. And
Well, that's why I'm here. I want people to realize there are going to be hard times. There's going to be dark times, but even during the Black Plague, even during the many revolutions we've had in the West, and especially since the last 100 years, since the two horrible brother wars and all of the war done under the GAE since, people still love, they still have marriages, they still have children, they sing, they make artwork. So it's very important for us to never let that flame go out. The evils that lord over us, that's the one thing they can't take from us unless we willingly give it to them. So don't let that flame go out. You have to keep it alive.
keep the flame burning. And is there anything you would like to shill before we leave?
No, just I, of course, have Discordant Dragons, 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday evenings, and my new psychological warfare and propaganda discussion stream with my friend Newsfist that happens at the same time slot, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. on Thursday evenings. Definitely come check that out. You can find me at Yizz the Eunuch on, YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. And of course, I have social media presence all over the place that you can find by the same name. So thank you for having me here. It was a wonderful conversation. I look forward to having you back on my channel again, and we can do this again one day and talk about more awesome fantasy stuff together.
Yes, I would love that. And in terms of this channel, this is probably going to be the last upload I do this year. I'm probably going to take a break over the December period, and probably get back to making content in the new year. So thank you all for watching, and have a lovely rest of the day now. And God be with you and your folk.
Amen. Good night.